Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. Respond, recognize, respect and reform to re-energize the world. That's the 4-point mantra Prime Minister Narendra Modi has emphasized upon at the Voice of Global South Summit convened by India. At the two-day summit, the Prime Minister made a case for human-centric globalization, stressing that India has always stood for a greater role for developing countries in determining our common future. The Prime Minister said, we want a globalization that brings prosperity and well-being to humanity as a whole, not the kind that leads to unequal distribution of vaccines or over-concentrated global supply chains. 125 countries participated in this virtual summit. These included 29 countries from Latin America and Caribbean, 47 countries from Africa, 7 countries from Europe, 31 countries from Asia, and 11 countries from Oceania. So in addition to providing a platform to countries of the Global South to represent their concerns, ideas and suggestions, India made a few announcements to increase cooperation with countries in this part of the world, sharing its experiences and expertise for the well-being of people. So on the show today, we are going to analyze some of the key outcomes of the Voice of Global South Summit, its significance for India and its G20 presidency. Joining us is an illustrious panel of experts. Pleased to welcome in the studio Mr. Virendra Gupta, President, Antarrashtriya Sahyog Parishad and former Ambassador. Ambassador, thank you for your time. Welcome to the program. And joining us virtually are two gentlemen, Mr. Don McLean-Gill. He's Director for South and Southeast Asia, Philippine Middle East Studies Association, and Mr. Rahul Kumar, Roving Editor, India Narrative. Thank you to both of you for joining us on the program as well. Mr. Gill, let me begin first with the kind of response that this summit has generated. India, through this summit, has tried to give a platform, a voice to these countries who are not represented at large at any of these multilateral institutions. So help us and our viewers understand in the first place the kind of response it has generated.
Right. Thank you so much for having me. And for us to understand the significance of this particular event, we have to put this in the context of history. If you could give me a minute or two.
Sure.
Now, throughout history, the turbulent shifts in the international geopolitical and economic landscape have often come at the expense of the developing world. This has led to a dominant one-sided understanding of international distribution of power, where rising or great powers technically focus on relative individual gains at the expense of the developing world. We look at Britain, Germany, US, and currently the issue of China. However, the rise of India as a great power serves as a remarkable rebuttal to these rigid and Western-centric approaches and perspectives. So during the Voice of Global Summit, the Voice of Global South Summit, India has illustrated that its rise will be based on consultative and people-centric principles and respect for sovereignty of partner countries, and that India was willing to play a proactive role to elevate, the mainstream the voices of the developing world amid the polarizing and traditional impact of the traditional status of power. So what we can see here now is a rising India that seeks to bank on inclusivity, development, prosperity, and at the same time, equity. So this is a significant cornerstone of an emerging multipolar world where India will play its part as an inclusive force that is also people-centric and very much equitable.
Ambassador, your thoughts on how significant is it going to be? This kind of initiative has been quite unique, but how is it going to help India in its G20 presidency and also beyond?
Well, it is a very important initiative, and it is a very vivid reflection of our deep commitment to what we say, Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam. In fact, Prime Minister has underlined this as the central theme of the G20 presidency of India. So it is not just an empty rhetoric. I think Prime Minister has shown by taking this initiative that India remains deeply committed and going beyond just the purview of self-interest and national interest, that India, is committed to providing a platform for the global South. Now, India has always made common cause with the global South. I mean, if you recall, in the 60s and the 70s, the Group of 77, the group of developing countries, that is, and the non-aligned movement. I mean, these were two very large and important forums for developing countries to come together. But however good that initiative might have been, the fact of the matter was that world never took very serious notice of us because we were essentially a very weak and underdeveloped nation. Today, there is a basic difference there, that India is an emerging power. The earlier panelists talked about India as a growing global power. Now, whatever, India is certainly very rising, and India's economy has grown many folds. So it is in this situation that when India talks about making a construct with the Global South and creating a platform, creating a voice for the Global South, I think that makes a very significant difference, particularly this year when India is heading the G20. So I think it's extremely important to take the developing countries, because developing countries have a very large stake in the future of the world. As the Prime Minister himself has stated, actually, that many of the problems that we are battling, these problems are not of the making of the developing countries, but we have to suffer the consequences.
And so the fact is, we are suffering the consequences, but we are nowhere to even discuss the solutions to these problems.
Absolutely. So to create a platform, to create a forum where the Global South can, voice their opinion, can voice their, what are their challenges, what are their responsibilities, what are the expectations. For instance, he talks about recognize, R, one of the R's, recognize the common but differentiated, responsibilities. Now, this was the central tenet of the climate change discussions earlier, that everybody has common stake in securing the climate, but the developed countries have caused the damage, have greater resources to be able to create mitigation and create a better environment. But all of that is forgotten. Now the developed countries are trying to create a narrative where everybody is lumped together. So I think it is important to come back to the basics and understand what is the particular situation, circumstances of the developing countries. So I think it's a very good initiative.
Clearly. And how do we take it forward from here now that we have the ideas, the concerns of the developing nations? How do we channelize it is going to be the next question. I'll come back to you in just a bit. Let me bring in Mr. Kumar into the discussion. Mr. Kumar, the fact that India has always advocated the cause and the cause for common good for all the developing countries. We did it in the 70s. We weren't taken seriously back then. Now we are taken seriously. There's one instance wherein the Prime Minister spoke to the Russian President speaking about how this is not an era for war. And we saw that statement being reiterated at multiple platforms, at the UNSC, by the UN chief, also at G20. Today, India is being taken seriously. Help us understand what has changed. Of course, there's the fact that India is today a fast-growing economy, but apart from that, in terms of our diplomatic outreach, how have we elevated our position that the world today has begun to take note of India's view?
Right. There's no doubt that the world is taking India seriously. The reason is not just the assertive diplomacy by our ministers and the Prime Minister, but the reason is there's this growth that has happened within the country. So science and technology, research, defense, economy, they've all risen over the last many years. So I guess as the country continues to topple one country after another in its GDP rankings, and as India looks at, some cutting edge technologies in pharmaceuticals, medicines, vaccines, besides, fintech, UPI, the transfer of money, all of these are making the country being taken seriously across the world, across the globe. The important point here is that India is in a position to share all of these technologies, all of this. And why is sharing these technologies important? What is important is that these technologies are empowering tens of millions of people in India, in the country, and they have the power to bring about sustainable development and growth in the human indices for the rest of the world. Now, the Prime Minister, in his address, said very clearly that you see, the last century was when the developing countries came out of the shackles of colonialism. Now, this is the time when a country from amongst those colonized countries has the power to bestow power to other countries to come up through science, technology, research. It could be as something like a space and a nuclear power as well. So I guess India has reached that point where it can very genuinely, sincerely sit with the developed countries and be counted amongst them, simply because we have the capacity, the financial, the diplomatic, the technological capacity, which can be shared with the rest of the world to bring it up.
Clearly, Ambassador, the fact that, that's where the Prime Minister asserts that we want a globalization which is human-centric, not the kind of globalization which creates unequal worlds, and something that we saw during the pandemic in terms of the unequal distribution of vaccines. So had it not been for India and the India-made vaccines, a large part of the global south would have still been unvaccinated because of the accessibility and the unaffordability of the vaccines. Now, from here on, the fact that we have given these countries a platform to bring in their ideas, their problems. The next big challenge is going to be how do we navigate through the challenges within the G20, wherein we are seeing a lot of rivalries itself. So there are polarizing, views, differing opinions within the G20 membership, and India has to navigate well to actually ensure that all of this that we have taken from the global south materializes into a worthwhile outcome at the G20.
Well, a lot of people have been talking about things. But what is more important is to walk the talk. Absolutely. And I think you mentioned about how India supplied the vaccines to needy countries which were suffering acute shortage. And
to more than 100 countries.
People were dying in those countries. So I think, our credibility, I would say, is at a good level. We've shown that when the world suffered the food shortage arising out of conflict in Ukraine. And mind you, even earlier, at a time when we were severely constrained of our resources at our own level, we never shied away from sharing our resources, our technology, sharing our educational institutions, everything with the developing countries. In fact, some of our leaders in the independence movement and who led the country afterwards, they said it publicly that India does not regard its independence as complete unless the other countries are also taken out of that deprivation. So I think our sense of sharing with the other countries, that is very well recognized. And today, as Rahul said, and I fully agree with him, the credibility also depends upon our own capacity. And I think what has made the difference today, why is it that India would be taken more seriously by the developing countries themselves and also the rest of the world, is that India has shown enormous amount of transformation of capacity. Whether you talk about the size of economy, whether you talk about the human resources, the cutting edge technology, in every respect, India is leading the world. And even in terms of the principle, the philosophy of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, I'll come back to it, because it's all about sharing. It's all about looking beyond our noses, and we are showing to the world that don't look at things in the short-term perspective. Don't look at things in the very narrow and rigid perspective of self-interest. Self-interest is not wrong. Pursuing national interest is not wrong. As we have done actually, West is accusing us of not taking a moralistic position on Ukraine and accusing us of buying oil from Russia. and we are justifying it as serving our national interest. But national interest has to be seen in a larger perspective, in a broader perspective, in a long-term perspective. And I think that is exactly the point that we are trying to make by making common cause with the Global South.
Taking forward that point, Mr. Gill, I'll come back to you. The fact that the Global South represents almost 3/4 of the humanity, but the challenge is going to be, and so far it's quite intriguing that for several decades, the interests of this part of the world have been overlooked. Nobody has, until now, given them a platform to articulate their concerns and take care of their problems. And as the ambassador rightly said, the problems which have not even been created by them, the problems created by the developed world, the implications are being seen by the developing countries, largely in the Global South. The fact that India today has taken a step towards not just giving them a platform to voice their concerns, but also greater collaboration, which is going to be human-centric in terms of public health, in terms of education, and we're willing to share our technologies and our best practices. But will that be enough? The fact is, there is messy regional politics, there is over-dependence on the developed world. So how are we going to actually ensure that all of this that we are envisioning today will actually materialize?
Right, thank you. And that is a very important question. I agree with Ambassador and my co-panelists as well. We have to understand that amid the tumultuous shifts taking place geopolitically, the importance that India, or the role of India as a rising power, indicates that the world must look into areas where the North can actually learn a thing or two from the South, and with such initiatives, to be able to harness collectively, to be able to bring out the best in the Global South, to be able to contribute proactively based on contemporary issues is significant. And this is where India is a leading voice. You have mentioned about collaborations. The summit resulted in a lot of India-led initiatives. Among them would be the establishment of a Global South Center of Excellence. Now, India's proactive contributions also highlight the need for not only state-led collaborations, but of course, collaborations of people to people, epistemic communities and civil societies across the Global South, looking forward to be able to address a number of issues based on and harnessing, of course, the variations of interests and, of course, the collectiveness of goals and concerns. So this, among many other examples, point to what we can expect as India continues to rise. So, the voice of a natural leader that seeks to proactively shape international affairs based on cooperation that is not founded on rigid politics or rigid bloc politics, but really looking into the least common denominator of shared interests, concerns, and goals will be the way forward. And of course, with such initiatives, we would be able to harness the collectiveness and of course the harmony of the developing world despite the differences, to be able to make an impactful appearance in global affairs. And this, I believe, would result in a more proactive level of cooperation between North and South, not one where the North dominates the South, but where it is an equitable level of framework of cooperation, where both sides work constructively based on the realization that today's problems in the world cannot be done alone, but through shared interests and collective determination to move forward in international politics.
Clearly, and towards ensuring that equity, Mr. Kumar, do you think India has the responsibility today, and because of the kind of relations we have with countries across the world, even if they are traditional rivals, at least India shares good relations with each of them, the fact that we cannot just become the voice of the Global South, but also the bridge between the Global North and the Global South, because otherwise there will be disparities which will continue. So does India have that responsibility and the role also to be the bridge? Mr. Kumar?
Absolutely. Often you see people wonder and people ask, could this conflict between Russia and Ukraine have been avoided or not? I feel if the European Union, NATO, Ukraine, the US, and Russia had spoken, had talked more, it is possible that this conflict might have been averted. So I guess this is the time not to have conflicts. I say that because we're just coming out, the world is just coming out of a very debilitating crisis the coronavirus, the COVID, the lockdowns. This is definitely not the time to have conflicts, but the time to have cooperation and collaboration. Now, India is perched at a point where, since its independence, India had maintained a certain strategic autonomy. India, as far as was possible, between the global rivalries, whether it was USA and USSR, then later USA, Russia, and now China, India has tried to maintain a certain distance from everyone and walk its own ground. So I think India is at that moment as of now where it can be a bridge between the developed and the developing world, and it also can actually handhold the developing world to be able to tackle issues like poverty, development. It is also possible that India, which has been along with France leading this initiative of the Solar Alliance, India could help the developing countries uh, come out and not have to follow an entire circle of development that impinges on their climate. So India would be able to probably help the developing countries leapfrog into development, into sustainability, and into economic growth, along with a human growth, where because we have built our own systems, our own finances. So it is not as if India is working on money that was earned through colonization or through some kind of. It has it's been our research, our technology, our development, the upliftment of millions of people over the last few decades. It is all our own.
Clearly,
So
you're
I
right.
think
And
India
that's
has
what,
that
Mr.
capacity.
Kumar, that's what makes our development partnership with the developing countries very different, Ambassador, from what China is pursuing, what the West is pursuing. But the kind of development partnership that we are engaged in with countries in Africa, with countries in Latin America, that is very unique because it also helps us enhance our credibility. All of this brings me to the question of the reform aspect. In the 4 mantras, the Prime Minister has specifically mentioned on the need to bring about reforms. Now, for decades, India has been talking about reforms at the multilateral institutions to reflect the new century realities. And that clearly seems to be a distant reality. It's not going to happen anytime soon because of the obstacles we all are well aware of. The fact that greater collaboration between countries of facing common problems, India extending them the assurance that we are not just going to be your voice, we are not just going to prioritize your priorities, but we are also going to share our best practices in terms of technology, in terms of whatever best we have to address these problems. Do you think this could lead to the emergence of a new world order if these multilateral institutions fail to reform themselves in order to remain relevant and important?
Well, let's be very clear about that this doesn't alter the global balance of power. The global balance is determined by very large and powerful countries. And India still has to contend with very critical issues relating to its security and economy. India has to manage its relationship with China. India has to manage the threat, increasing threat from international terrorism. India has to navigate its relationship with Europe, which means a lot to us economically, and Russia, in the midst of a total breakdown of relationship. So I think these things, still matter a lot to us. But the fact that we have found time, the fact that we are paying attention to this issue of Global South, is actually illustrative of our very inclusive approach. Inclusive approach not merely in development, but inclusive approach in international relations is far more difficult to understand because the traditional practice has been to dismiss the weak and underdeveloped countries. We've been dismissed like that in the past. But having arrived at a certain stage, we are willing to take along everybody. So I think this initiative will certainly make a difference, will make the world see the reason for accommodating the aspirations of the developing countries.
Clearly, and the fact
India
that
is certainly, wanting to give voice to that.
certainly, and the more important aspect that we are prioritizing the importance of practical outcomes for the well-being of humanity. Perhaps that is what's setting our
Absolutely.
approach different from what the others are trying to do. But nevertheless, it's a good initiative. Let's see the kind of problems that India has to navigate through and the outcomes that we see in actually coordinating with countries of the global south. It's a tough walk ahead for India. That having been said, time allows me to take up only that much on the program today. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us on this program and sharing your thoughts, your views with us and our viewers. And to you viewers, thank you very much for your time. I'll see you same time on Monday now. Take good care of yourselves. Have a good weekend.